You've been doing everything right, managing stress, eating cleaner, walking every day, and yet the belly fat won't move. Here's what's actually happening. After 45, cortisol and visceral fat don't work as two separate problems. They form a closed loop, each one continuously feeding the other. And fixing only one side leaves the other running, which is exactly why the cycle holds. That's not a willpower issue. That's biology. Here's how the loop forms, what locks it in after 45, and the 2 points where it breaks. Before we trace the loop, 3 things shift in your biology after 45. Together, they set the conditions for this cycle to form and hold. First, your stress response becomes more reactive with age. As estrogen falls in women and testosterone declines in men, a natural hormonal buffer is progressively removed. That buffer once modulated the height and duration of your cortisol response. Without it, the same stressor that caused a brief spike at 35 now produces a higher peak, and that peak lasts longer at 50. Second, visceral fat is more cortisol sensitive than any other fat depot in your body. Visceral fat cells carry a higher density of glucocorticoid receptors, the docking sites cortisol binds to. This means cortisol preferentially directs fat storage toward the deep abdominal cavity, not the arms, not the legs, specifically the fat surrounding your organs. Third, as visceral fat accumulates, it begins producing its own cortisol from within. This is the shift most people and most practitioners don't know about. Most assume the mechanism is straightforward. Stress raises cortisol. Cortisol builds belly fat. Reduce the stress, the cortisol drops, and the fat follows. But after 45, that model is incomplete. The fat is no longer just responding to your stress, it is generating its own signal. That's what we're going to trace, stage by stage. Stage 1. The trigger. Every stress response activates your HPA axis. A difficult conversation, a missed deadline, a poor night of sleep, a skipped meal. Your hypothalamus sends a signal. Your pituitary responds. Your adrenal glands release cortisol into the bloodstream. This is a normal, functional response. It is not the problem. Here's what makes this different after 45. The hormonal buffers that once kept cortisol spikes short and contained have declined. The same stressor now produces a higher cortisol peak and a longer recovery window. Your stress system is running at a higher baseline with less capacity to self-regulate than it did a decade ago. Stage 2. Cortisol finds its target. Cortisol circulates and binds to glucocorticoid receptors throughout your body. But not all fat tissue responds equally. Visceral fat surrounds your liver, pancreas, and intestines. It carries a significantly higher glucocorticoid receptor density than subcutaneous fat. Research has confirmed that excess cortisol produces 2 to 5 times more visceral fat accumulation than elsewhere in the body. Cortisol isn't just raising fat storage, it's specifically directing fat to the deepest, most metabolically active depot. Here's what makes this different after 45. As sex hormones decline, their protective effect on fat distribution weakens. The cortisol signal flows more directly to the visceral depot with less biological resistance than at younger ages. The same cortisol spike that added subcutaneous fat at 35 is adding visceral fat at 50. Stage 3. The loop closes the discovery most people never reach. This is where most explanations stop, but this is where the real mechanism begins. Visceral fat is not a passive storage depot. Inside visceral fat cells lives an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD1. Its job: convert inactive cortisone, a stored, deactivated form of cortisol, back into fully active cortisol, inside the fat tissue itself. Your visceral fat is manufacturing its own cortisol supply, on top of whatever your adrenal glands are producing, independently of how calm you feel, independently of whether you meditated this morning. Research examining 11-beta-HSD. One expression found a direct relationship. This enzyme's activity is proportional to visceral fat mass. The more visceral fat you carry, the more of this enzyme you have, and the more internal cortisol your fat generates every single day. Here's what makes this different. After 45, 11. Beta, HSD. One activity increases with age rising, particularly after menopause in women and testosterone decline in men. The cortisol factory inside your belly fat becomes more productive each year, not less. This is why people who genuinely reduce psychological stress often see almost no change in visceral fat markers. Their adrenal cortisol is lower, but the fat tissue didn't respond. It is already running the loop on its own supply. Stage 4. The amplification why the plateau is biological, not personal. The loop tightens here. Local cortisol produced inside visceral fat enters the portal vein, the same delivery system discussed in the previous video. It travels directly to the liver and reinforces insulin resistance there. Meanwhile, chronically elevated cortisol from both adrenal and fat tissue sources raises blood glucose. Higher blood glucose demands more insulin, adding the second arm of the spike. When cortisol and insulin are elevated simultaneously, something specific happens inside fat cells. An enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. The primary fat storage enzyme increases its activity by over 5-fold. More fat storage. Faster accumulation. Deeper into the visceral depot. Here's what makes this different after 45. Insulin sensitivity already declines with age as a baseline biological shift. The cortisol-insulin combination hits a system with less capacity to recover. The spike is higher. The recovery window is longer. The fat accumulation per episode is greater. And this is the biological reality underneath the frustration many people feel. They are not failing because of willpower. They are facing a self-amplifying mechanism, one that sustains itself and tightens with time when only one side is addressed. Stage 5. The 2 breakpoints. The loop has 2 vulnerable points, and both must be activated in the same time window. Breakpoint 1 is upstream. Reduce the cortisol signal reaching visceral fat. The most evidence-backed method is consistent low-intensity aerobic movement zone, 2 exercise. 30 minutes, 4 to 5 times per week, at a pace where you can hold a full conversation. This is not about burning calories. It is about physiologically lowering HPA axis reactivity, reducing the height of cortisol spikes, and shortening recovery time. Breakpoint 2 is downstream. Reduce the visceral fat mass itself, and with it, the 11, beta, HSD, 1 enzyme pool. Every unit of visceral fat removed directly reduces the internal cortisol factory. The most effective dietary approach is not aggressive caloric restriction, which raises cortisol further as a survival signal. It is a Mediterranean-aligned eating pattern, protein and healthy fat at every meal, with reduced added sugar. Olive oil and fatty fish as primary fat sources. The same protocol from the liver video applies here. When both breakpoints run at the same time, cortisol falling from the top, visceral fat reducing from the bottom, the loop has no mechanism left to sustain itself. Here's how to apply both breakpoints. 4 specific adjustments to run in parallel, starting this week. Protocol 1. Zone 2. Movement 30 minutes, 4 to 5 times per week. Zone 2 is the upstream cortisol reducer, not a calorie burner. High-intensity exercise spikes cortisol and refeeds stage 1 of the loop. The test is simple. If you can hold a full conversation while moving, you are in the zone. If you are breathless, you have crossed into cortisol-stimulating territory. Start with 4 sessions of 30 minutes brisk walking, low-resistance cycling, or light swimming. Consistent Zone 2 over 8 to 12 weeks shows measurable reductions in both baseline cortisol and visceral fat mass, without caloric restriction, without high-intensity effort. Protocol 2. Protein and healthy fat at every meal, especially breakfast. Stage 4 showed that cortisol combined with insulin triggers over 5-fold fat storage enzyme activity. The lever. Prevent isolated carbohydrate meals, especially in the morning, when cortisol is naturally at its daily peak. Always pair carbohydrates with a protein and a healthy fat source. Eggs, Greek yogurt, or smoked salmon with olive oil dampens the cortisol-insulin combined spike before it forms. This is meal composition awareness applied to the precise window where the loop is most vulnerable. Protocol 3. Run both interventions simultaneously, not sequentially. Stage 3 showed that visceral fat generates its own cortisol independently of your stress level. Stress reduction alone will not shrink the visceral fat. And dietary changes alone will not lower the cortisol signal the fat is already generating. Both must run in the same 4 to 8 week window. Start both this week. The loop cannot be broken sequentially. Protocol 4. Avoid aggressive caloric restriction while the loop is active. A steep caloric deficit is interpreted as a physiological threat and triggers a cortisol response. That response feeds directly back into stage 2, preferential visceral fat storage. You can lose weight from the arms, face, and subcutaneous layer while the visceral depot holds during a hard cut. Moderate adjustment combined with zone 2 movement produces more visceral fat loss than aggressive restriction, and it does so without activating the cortisol arm of the loop you are trying to break. This loop is not a personal failure. It is a biological mechanism, one that did not exist at this intensity before 45. And now that you can see it stage by stage, you know exactly where to intervene and why both sides must move at the same time. Research from the Mayo Clinic has found something consistent. People who reduce visceral fat by midlife show markedly lower rates of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. They also show significantly lower rates of cognitive decline well into their 70s and 80s. The loop works in both directions. Break it now, and the biology that has been working against you begins working for you. If this finally explained why one-sided approaches haven't worked, share it with someone who needs to understand this. Next video. How poor sleep is the hidden third driver that feeds both sides of this loop every single night. I'll see you there.